All right, so today we're going to try to unpack something pretty interesting. The power of first impressions and how those tiny little cues we give off can really make or break us, especially when the stakes are high.
Absolutely. And, there's no better example of this than that infamous Shark Tank pitch where Jamie Siminoff, the inventor behind the now wildly successful Ring doorbell system, kind of stumbled right out of the gate.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one vividly.
So picture this, right? The lights, the cameras, the sharks all staring you down, and the first thing Jamie says is his name. But he says it like this: "It's Jamie," with that questioning upward inflection.
Oh, man, that up talk.
Up talk,
Yeah.
exactly. And while he obviously recovered and went on to build an empire, research actually shows that that kind of question inflection at the end of a statement can be a real charisma killer. It sends this message of uncertainty, like you're not even sure of your own name, so why should anyone trust you with their investment?
It's amazing how these tiny little signals can have such a huge impact. It's like our brains are wired to pick up on them, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. And that's just scratching the surface of what we're diving into today. We're talking about the whole world of cues, nonverbal, vocal, verbal the works, and how understanding and using them effectively can completely change the game in how you're perceived and how people respond to you.
And the crazy thing is just how much these cues can actually predict about us and about others. I mean, we're talking predicting leadership potential in seconds, even forecasting divorce with like 93% accuracy based on a single interaction.
Yeah, it's wild. There's research on how vocal tone can predict which doctors get sued more often, how juries make decisions, how people fare in speed dating, even how elections turn out. It's all connected to these subtle signals we're sending and receiving constantly.
So in this deep dive, we're going to pull from a ton of different research case studies, practical strategies to give you a real solid understanding of how these cues work in every situation, from those everyday conversations to those high-pressure make-or-break moments.
Because let's be real. Misreading these cues or sending the wrong ones can lead to missed opportunities being underestimated or just not getting your message across. It's about realizing that you're always communicating even when you're not saying a word.
Exactly. So by the end of this, we want you to walk away with a toolkit of strategies that will help you project confidence, make a real impact, and build those genuine connections that matter. So think of it as a way to level up your communication game across the board.
Sounds good to me.
So to really kick things off, I think it's important to get a handle on the two fundamental pillars of what we call charisma. These are warmth and competence, and understanding how they work together is key.
Yeah, you got it. Think of warmth as all those qualities that make you seem trustworthy, approachable, likable. It's that feeling people get when they're like, hey, I feel comfortable around this person. I think they have good intentions.
And then you have competence, which is all about your perceived skills and ability to get things done. It's that sense of, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. They can deliver. And what's interesting is that you really need both to be truly charismatic.
Right, on psychologist Susan Fisk has done some really fascinating work on this. She points out that an imbalance between warmth and competence can be a real problem. Like, if you're seen as super competent but low on warmth, you might come across as intimidating or even untrustworthy. People might think, yeah, they're brilliant, but I'm not sure I can trust them.
On the flip side, someone who's overflowing with warmth but lacking in competence might be super likable but not taken seriously. It's like, oh, they're such a sweetheart, but I'm not sure they can handle this project.
Yeah, the ideal scenario is finding that sweet spot where you project both warmth and competence, where people feel like they can trust you and respect your abilities at the same time.
And this is something we see play out all the time with public figures. Think about someone like Mark Zuckerberg or Anna Wintour or Elon Musk. They're all incredibly accomplished and competent, but they've also sometimes struggled with public perception because they haven't always projected that warmth.
It's that classic image of the brilliant but aloof genius who might be a little too focused on results and not enough on connecting with people on a human level.
And it's interesting how often you see these highly competent individuals partnering with people who naturally exude warmth. It's like they're creating a more balanced dynamic duo where one person brings the brains and the other brings the heart.
Totally. It's a strategic way to round out their public image and make them more relatable and appealing to a wider audience.
So this leads us to the idea of the charisma zone, which is that ideal balance of warmth and competence. But the cool thing is it's not a fixed point. The most charismatic people are actually really good at adjusting their cues depending on the situation and who they're with.
It's like they have this internal charisma dial that they can turn up or down as needed to find the right balance for each interaction.
Exactly. Yeah. Like think about Oprah Winfrey. She's definitely known for her incredible warmth. She's empathetic, She shares her own vulnerabilities. She connects with people on a deep level.
Hmm.
But she's also a super sharp interviewer who asks tough questions and clearly knows her stuff.
Right. She embodies both warmth and competence in a way that's really powerful. Then you have someone like Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, who's known for her strength and decisiveness.
Definitely a more competence-focused persona.
But even she used warmth cues strategically. Like you could see the passion in her speeches. And she often used a subtle head tilt, which is a nonverbal signal of approachability and optimism. It's like even someone known for their toughness understood the importance of showing that human side.
And this adaptability is key.
Mhm.
If you look at early interviews with Jeff Bezos, you'll see that he was much more openly warm and smiley back then. It suggests that as Amazon grew and the stakes got higher, he adjusted his charisma dial to project more competence and authority.
Makes sense, right? Different situations call for different approaches.
So the takeaway here is that it's not just about sending the right cues, it's also about being able to read the cues that others are sending you. This is where decoding and encoding come into play.
Decoding is all about accurately understanding the cues that other people are giving off. It's like being able to read their nonverbal language, their tone of voice, their word choices, and figure out what they're really trying to communicate.
And encoding is the flip side. It's about consciously projecting the cues that you want to send to create a specific impression or achieve a particular outcome.
And the amazing thing is that nonverbal communication plays a much bigger role in all of this than most people realize. Research shows that somewhere between 65 to 90% of our communication is actually nonverbal.
Wow, that's huge. So let's break down some specific warmth cues that you can start using to build stronger connections and make people feel more comfortable around you.
One of the simplest but most effective is leaning in. When someone is telling you something important or sharing something personal, subtly leaning towards them shows that you're engaged and interested.
It's like you're non-verbally saying, I'm so invested in what you're saying that I want to be physically closer to hear you better.
And that subtle shift in proximity can make a big difference. It creates a sense of connection and intimacy, and it often encourages the other person to open up even more.
On the flip side, it's important to be aware of what we call blocking behaviors. These are physical barriers that we unconsciously put up between ourselves and others, and they can really hinder our ability to connect.
Yeah, the classic example is crossing your arms, but it can also be things like holding a bag or a laptop in front of you, or even just keeping your hands clasped tightly in your lap.
While these actions might feel comforting, especially if you're nervous, they actually send a signal of being closed off or unapproachable.
Yeah.
It's like you're putting up a wall between yourself and the other person.
And people pick up on that subconsciously. Former Secret Service agent Evie Poumpouras, who used to host that show Spy Games, had this really interesting technique during interrogations. She would deliberately put her phone and watch away so that the person she was questioning knew they had her undivided attention.
That's a great example of what we call anti-blocking. It's about consciously removing those physical barriers to create a more open and inviting atmosphere.
And this is something to keep in mind even in everyday situations. Like if you're giving a presentation, avoid hiding behind a podium or clutching the microphone too tightly. It creates a sense of distance between you and the audience.
Another key warmth cue is fronting, which is simply turning your entire torso to face the person you're talking to. It might seem obvious, but it makes a huge difference in how engaged and respectful you appear.
Think about it. If you're talking to your boss and you only turn your head towards them but keep your body angled away, it sends a subtle message that you're not fully present or invested in the conversation.
But when you turn your whole body to face them, it shows that you're giving them your full attention and respect. And this applies to all kinds of interactions, from casual conversations to job interviews to meeting your partner's parents for the first time.
And this also plays into how you set up your physical space. Like, if you have a desk job, think about how your desk is positioned. Are you encouraging people to front you during conversations, or are you making it difficult for them to fully engage with you?
And it's not just about your own space. Pay attention to where other people point their feet and their torsos. It can tell you a lot about where their true focus lies. Even if they're saying all the right things, their body language might reveal a different story.
Then we have personal space, which is a whole fascinating world in itself. Anthropologist Edward T. Hall did some groundbreaking work on this. He found that we all have these invisible bubbles of personal space, and the size of these bubbles varies depending on our relationship with the person.
So like with close friends and family, we're comfortable being in very close proximity. But with strangers or acquaintances, we tend to maintain a greater distance.
Exactly, and those distances actually have names. Like, there's the intimate zone, the personal zone, the social zone, and the public zone.
And what's interesting is that we can both consciously adjust our distance to signal how we feel about someone, and we can also read other people's distance to get a sense of how they feel about us.
Like, think about it. If someone takes a step back when you approach them, it could be a sign that they're feeling uncomfortable or that they need a little more space.
And on the flip side, if someone leans in close when they're talking to you, it could be a sign that they're feeling connected and engaged.
Research has even shown that we tend to increase our distance from people after we've had a negative interaction with them. It's like our bodies are physically reflecting our emotional state.
So in a work setting, for example, you might notice that people who are having a conflict tend to sit further apart from each other at meetings, or that someone who's feeling excluded might position themselves on the outskirts of the group.
And then you have all these ways to bridge those spatial zones to create a stronger sense of connection. Like, you can lean in slightly, you can level your height with someone, you can use open gestures that extend into their space, you can offer them something, you can even give a brief, appropriate touch, like a handshake.
We see this all the time on Shark Tank.
Yeah.
Those entrepreneurs who are really successful are often the ones who find ways to get closer to the sharks, whether it's by handing them a product sample or inviting them to participate in a demonstration.
It's all about strategically using space to create that sense of intimacy and rapport.
Another super powerful warmth cue is eye contact. It might seem like a no-brainer, but there's a lot more to it than just looking someone in the eye.
For starters, every time we make eye contact with someone, our brains release oxytocin, which is that feel-good hormone associated with bonding, trust, and social connection. So it literally creates a chemical connection between people.
And what's even cooler is that oxytocin actually enhances our ability to decode other people's nonverbal cues. So the more eye contact we make, the better we become at reading those subtle signals.
But it's not about staring someone down. The key is to cultivate what's called gazing with purpose, which means actively searching the other person's face for microexpressions and other cues that reveal their emotions and thoughts.
It's like you're really trying to see them and understand their perspective. And those brief eye locks, where you hold someone's gaze for a few seconds, can create a real surge of connection and trust.
But of course, there are also some don'ts when it comes to eye contact. Like, avoid staring intensely, which can feel creepy and aggressive.
Yeah.
And be mindful of cultural differences, because what's considered appropriate eye contact in one culture might be seen as rude or disrespectful in another.
Here's a little tip. If you're dealing with someone who tends to dominate conversations, subtly reducing your eye contact with them can actually help to quiet them down.
Yeah.
It's like you're non-verbally signaling that you're not as engaged, which can encourage them to wrap things up.
Another warmth cue that we often overlook is nodding. When you nod in agreement or understanding, it encourages the other person to keep talking, and it makes them feel heard and validated.
Research has shown that nodding can actually increase the amount of time that people speak by up to 67%, which is pretty amazing. And it even works over the phone because it subtly influences your tone of voice, making you sound more empathetic and encouraging.
But, as with everything, there's a sweet spot. Avoid going full bobblehead mode where you're nodding constantly, because that can come across as insincere or even a little bit manic.
If you find yourself nodding too much, try mixing in some subtle head tilts, which also convey warmth and engagement, but in a more measured way.
Yeah.
And be strategic about your nods. Like, use them to greet someone, to show agreement, to encourage them to elaborate on a point.
Now let's talk about a really interesting nonverbal cue, the eyebrow raise. It's such a quick and subtle gesture, but it can convey a ton of meaning in a split second.
It's like a nonverbal shorthand for saying, I'm interested, I'm curious,
Yeah.
I'm paying attention, and it can really enhance your connection with someone.
We use eyebrow raises all the time, often without even realizing it. Like, when we're asking for confirmation or when we're listening intently to someone on a video call and we want to show that we're engaged even though we're muted.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson has even pointed out that those tiny, almost imperceptible eyebrow raises can actually reveal a lot about our underlying preferences and biases.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how much information we can communicate with just a slight movement of our brows.
But it's important to make sure you're doing a genuine eyebrow raise and not just widening your eyes, because that can be misinterpreted as fear or surprise.
And as with all nonverbal cues, be aware of cultural differences. In some cultures, like in Japan, a prolonged eyebrow raise can actually be seen as a sign of romantic interest, so you definitely want to be careful with that one.
Okay, now let's move on to smiling, which is like the ultimate warmth cue. It's so simple yet so powerful.
When we smile, we instantly become more approachable and likable. And research has shown that we perceive smiling faces as being almost 10 times warmer than neutral faces.
Plus, smiling actually makes us more memorable. When we try to recall a smiling face, the reward center in our brains lights up, which means we're more likely to remember that person and associate them with positive feelings.
But not all smiles are created equal. There's a big difference between a quick, polite smile and what we call a savor smile, which is a smile that lingers for a little longer and conveys genuine enjoyment or appreciation.
A savor smile is like a warm hug for your face. It takes about half a second to fully spread across your features, and it often triggers laughter, which is another amazing bonding cue.
So next time you want to really connect with someone, try giving them a savor smile. You might be surprised at how much it brightens their day and strengthens your bond.
Another great warmth cue is mirroring, which is basically subtly matching the other person's body language and tone of voice. When we mirror someone, it creates a sense of rapport and makes them feel like we're on the same wavelength.
But the key here is to be subtle. You don't want to be a copycat or make it obvious that you're mimicking them. It should feel natural and organic.
Focus on mirroring positive cues like open body language and a warm tone of voice. But avoid mirroring negative cues like crossed arms or a frown, because that will just create a negative feedback loop.
And if a particular cue feels forced or awkward for you, don't do it. Mirroring is all about finding that sweet spot where you're reflecting the other person's energy without losing your own authenticity.
And finally, remember that you can amplify the effect of your warmth cues by pairing them with specific words and phrases. Like if someone says something interesting, you can respond with, "That's so fascinating," while raising your eyebrows slightly. Or if you agree with someone, you can say, "I totally agree," while nodding your head.
It's all about creating that synergy between your verbal and nonverbal communication to send a really strong message of warmth and connection.
Okay, so now let's shift gears and talk about competence cues, those nonverbal and vocal signals that make you seem more capable, confident, and in control.
One of the foundational competence cues is good posture. You can even do a quick self-assessment right now. Stand up with a pen in each hand, as if you're about to start a professional conversation, and check your posture.
The three key things to pay attention to are your feet, your shoulders, and your head. Your feet should be planted firmly on the ground with your toes pointing forward. Your shoulders should be relaxed and pulled slightly back, and your head should be level, not tilted up or down.
Even small adjustments in these areas can make a big difference in how confident you appear and feel. Avoid fidgeting with your feet, hunching over your phone, or tilting your head too far in either direction.
And here's an interesting tidbit. Some research suggests that using a larger screen, whether it's a computer monitor or a TV, can actually make you feel more assertive and confident.
So maybe it's time to upgrade to that giant monitor you've been eyeing.
Now let's talk about a really subtle but powerful competence cue, the lower lid flex. This involves slightly tightening your lower eyelids, and it can convey a sense of intense focus, discernment, and scrutiny.
It's like you're saying, I'm paying close attention to every detail, and it can make you seem more serious and authoritative.
But this is a cue that requires some finesse. If you overdo it or use it in the wrong context, it can backfire and make you seem confused or even suspicious.
If you notice someone giving you a lower lid flex, it's a good sign to pause and check in with them. Make sure they understand what you're saying and address any concerns they might have.
There's a great example of this where a presenter was giving a talk on the effects of oxytocin, and they noticed that the CEO of the company was giving them a subtle lower lid flex.
Oh, that's a high-pressure situation.
Totally. But instead of ignoring it, the presenter stopped and asked the CEO if they had any questions. And it turned out that the CEO was just a little confused about one of the concepts. So the presenter was able to clarify things and build rapport with the CEO at the same time.
That's a perfect example of how decoding and encoding work together.
Absolutely. Now, if you want to use the lower lid flex strategically, you can try it when you're listening intently to someone or when you're giving a presentation and you want to convey a sense of authority and focus.
And some people even find it attractive because it can make you seem more intense and mysterious.
Another crucial competence cue is using purposeful gestures. When you gesture effectively, it helps to emphasize your points, make your message more memorable, and increase your overall persuasiveness.
Think about those TED Talk speakers who use their hands to paint vivid pictures in the air or to highlight key points in their presentations. They're not just flailing their arms around. They're using gestures strategically to enhance their message.
And there's even a gesture called humility hands, which involves resting your open hands in front of you at waist level while you're listening to someone. It conveys a sense of openness, calmness, and attentiveness.
And then you have palm power, which is all about using open palms to signal honesty, sincerity, and invitation.
Yeah. Throughout history, open palms have been associated with trustworthiness and good intentions, while closed fists or pointed fingers have been seen as more aggressive or accusatory.
Think about Evita Peron's iconic gesture of raising her arms with open palms. It's a posture that's often used by leaders and winners to project confidence and inspire trust.
So when you're pointing at something, try using an open palm instead of a finger. And remember that the size of your gestures should generally match the size of the space you're in. Bigger gestures for bigger rooms, smaller gestures for smaller spaces.
Now let's talk about vocal cues, because your voice is a powerful tool for projecting competence. Some key things to focus on are a lower tone of voice, a neutral inflection, eliminating vocal fry, using power pauses effectively, and controlling your volume.
We've already talked about the dangers of uptalk, so make sure you're ending your statements with a downward inflection to convey confidence and certainty.
And vocal fry, that creaky, gravelly sound that some people make at the end of their sentences, can be a real charisma killer. It makes you sound unsure of yourself and lacking in authority.
If you're prone to vocal fry, try to speak from your diaphragm and make sure you're taking deep breaths to support your voice.
And those pesky verbal fillers like, it can really undermine your credibility. They make you sound unprepared and unsure of what you're talking about.
The best way to combat verbal fillers is to practice the power of the pause. Take a deep breath before you speak and allow yourself a moment of silence to gather your thoughts. This demonstrates confidence and control, and it gives your listeners a chance to process what you're saying.
And finally, make sure you're adjusting your volume to the situation. Speaking too softly can make you seem timid, while speaking too loudly can come across as aggressive. The goal is to find that sweet spot where you're projecting your voice clearly and confidently without overwhelming your listeners.
Okay, now let's flip the script and talk about those danger zone cues, the nonverbal and vocal habits that can sabotage your charisma and make you seem less likable and competent.
One of the biggest ones is lip pursing, which is when you press your lips together tightly into a thin line. It often indicates that you're holding back your true feelings or that you're disapproving of something.
We saw this a lot with Lance Armstrong when he was denying his use of performance-enhancing drugs. His words were saying one thing, but his tightly pursed lips were telling a different story.
And then you have distancing behaviors like constantly checking your phone while you're talking to someone or physically stepping back when someone approaches you.
These behaviors send a message that you're not interested or engaged, and they can really damage your relationships.
And comfort gestures like touching your face, playing with your hair, or rubbing your legs can be super distracting. They make you seem nervous and insecure, and they can even make the people around you feel uncomfortable.
And then we have all those blocking behaviors that we talked about earlier, like crossing your arms, hunching your shoulders, or covering your mouth with your hand.
These behaviors are often subconscious, but they can really undermine your credibility and make you seem closed off and unapproachable.
And we can't forget about facial expressions. Even when we think we have a neutral face, we might be inadvertently sending negative cues.
Like that resting bothered face or RBF that some people have. It might not be intentional, but it can make you seem unapproachable or even hostile.
And then you have those micro expressions that flash across our faces for a fraction of a second and reveal our true emotions. Like a subtle eye roll, a fleeting smirk, or a slight frown.
These expressions are often involuntary, but they can be incredibly telling. And research has shown that people who are good at reading microexpressions are better at detecting deception and understanding other people's motivations.
So the key takeaway here is to be mindful of your facial expressions and try to project the emotions that you want people to perceive. Whether it's warmth, competence, or something in between your face is constantly sending signals.
And finally, remember that it's all about looking for clusters of cues, not just isolated signals. A single gesture or expression might not tell you much, but when you see multiple cues pointing in the same direction, it's a pretty good indicator of what's really going on.
So now that we've covered some of the most common danger zone cues, let's dive back into the world of vocal cues and talk specifically about those that project likability and warmth.
One of the easiest ways to warm up your voice is to simply smile when you speak. It might sound silly, but it makes a huge difference in how friendly and approachable you sound.
And when you're greeting someone, try using an out-breath hello. It conveys a sense of enthusiasm and excitement, and it makes the other person feel welcomed and appreciated.
But be careful not to use an angry hello unless you're intentionally trying to intimidate someone.
And those little vocal warm-up sounds like, ooh, and are great for encouraging people to keep talking and showing that you're listening and engaged.
Think about how baristas use these sounds to acknowledge your order and make you feel heard. It's a subtle but effective way to build rapport.
And if you want to sound more engaging and dynamic, try to vary your pitch, pace, and rhythm. A monotone voice can be really boring, and it makes it hard for people to stay focused.
Inject some emotion into your voice. Emphasize key words and phrases, and don't be afraid to let your personality shine through.
And you can also use vocal mirroring to build rapport. This involves subtly matching the other person's tone of voice and word choices.
It's a way of saying, I'm on the same wavelength as you, and it can make people feel more comfortable and connected.
But as with all mirroring, be subtle and authentic. Don't try to force it, or it will come across as fake.
And finally, if you're looking for ways to improve your vocal delivery, try channeling some of your favorite speakers. Think about the people whose voices you find engaging and charismatic, and try to incorporate some of their techniques into your own speaking style.
Now let's talk about verbal cues, because the words we choose can have a powerful impact on how we're perceived.
Certain words have been shown to trigger specific associations with warmth and competence. Like in one study, people who played a game called a community game were more likely to cooperate than those who played the same game, but it was called the Wall Street game.
So the words we use can actually prime people to see us in a particular light.
And this is especially important in written communication, like emails, because we don't have nonverbal cues to rely on. The words we choose carry even more weight.
If you want to come across as warmer in your emails, try incorporating words like goal, together, happy, and desire.
And if you want to project competence, try using words like forward, outcome, and power through.
You can even do an email audit, where you go back and look at your sent emails to see what kinds of words you tend to use. This can give you some valuable insights into your communication style and how you might be perceived by others.
And don't forget about your email subject lines and closings. They're like mini opportunities to inject some charisma into your messages.
A subject line like, your expertise is requested, is more likely to get someone's attention than something generic like meeting request.
And a closing like cheers or warmly is more personable than just sincerely.
And speaking of written communication, the words you use in your resume and online profiles are super important too.
Make sure your headline and summary statements clearly convey both your warmth and competence, and use keywords that will resonate with potential employers or clients.
And it's worth noting that gender stereotypes can play a role in how our words are perceived. So women might need to be more intentional about using language that projects competence, while men might need to focus on conveying warmth.
And successful brands are masters at using language to create a desired image and evoke specific emotions.
Like Casper mattresses, they describe their products as being obsessively engineered, which conveys competence, and outrageously comfortable, which speaks to warmth.
It's a perfect example of how to balance those two key dimensions in your messaging.
And when you're interacting with people one-on-one, try to tailor your language to their dominant charisma style. If you know someone is more warmth-oriented, start the conversation with something personal or ask about their family.
But if you're talking to someone who's more competence-driven, get straight to the point and focus on the facts and figures.
You can even subtly mirror their word choices and communication style to build rapport.
It's like you're speaking their language, which makes them feel more comfortable and understood.
And this even applies to emojis. If you notice that someone uses a lot of emojis in their messages, try mirroring their usage. It's a subtle but effective way to show that you're paying attention and that you respect their communication style.
But as always, be authentic. If a particular word or phrase doesn't feel natural to you, you don't use it.
Okay, now let's wrap things up by talking about visual cues, because they can play a huge role in shaping our perceptions of warmth and competence.
Think about how much thought companies put into their branding and packaging. It's all about creating a visual identity that conveys their desired message.
Like those sugar fina candy cubes. They're so beautifully designed that they make you feel like you're indulging in a luxury experience.
And the fonts we choose, the colors we use, the images we display, all send subtle messages about who we are and what we value.
Research has shown that certain fonts can actually influence our memory and comprehension. Like Comic Sans might not be the most professional-looking font, but it's been shown to improve memory recall.
And the overall aesthetic appeal of a document or presentation can have a big impact on how engaged people are with the content.
We're naturally drawn to things that are visually pleasing, and we're more likely to pay attention to information that's presented in an attractive way.
And even small details in our environment can influence our perceptions and behaviors. Like in one study, people who were given heavier clipboards rated job candidates as being more serious and qualified.
And think about the difference between a doctor's office that's decorated in a warm and inviting way versus one that's cold and sterile. It can make a huge difference in how comfortable and trusting patients feel.
And images are incredibly powerful. They can evoke strong emotions and influence our behavior in subtle ways.
Like in one study, call center operators who had a picture of a marathon runner on their desks raised significantly more money for charity than those who didn't have the picture.
So when you're choosing images for your website, your social media profiles, or your presentations, think about the message you want to convey and choose visuals that will support that message.
And your personal appearance is also a form of visual communication. Think about the clothes you wear, the hairstyle, you have the accessories you choose. They all contribute to your overall image and how you're perceived by others.
Like David Nihill, who accidentally created a problem solver brand for himself simply by rolling up his sleeves whenever he was working on a project.
It's a great example of how even small details can make a big difference.
And color psychology is a whole fascinating field in itself. Different colors evoke different emotions and associations.
Like blue is often associated with calmness, trust, and stability, which is why it's a popular choice for corporate branding.
While green is associated with nature growth and harmony, which makes it a good choice for companies that want to project an eco-friendly image.
So when you're choosing colors for your website, your presentations, or even your wardrobe, think about the message you want to send and choose colors that will support that message.
And it's important to acknowledge that visual cues can also be a source of bias, unfortunately.
Like, studies have shown that people are more likely to perceive someone as competent and trustworthy if they're attractive or if they dress in a certain way.
And there's also a lot of bias based on race, gender, and socioeconomic status, which can have a real impact on people's opportunities and outcomes.
So it's crucial to be aware of these biases and to challenge them whenever we see them.
And on a personal level, we can all work to be more mindful of the visual cues we're sending and receiving and to make sure we're not making snap judgments based on superficial factors.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a ton of ground. We've talked about the power of nonverbal, vocal, and verbal cues, and how understanding these cues can help you to project confidence, build stronger connections, and achieve your goals.
But this is just the beginning. The real work starts now, when you start putting these principles into practice in your everyday life.
Pay attention to the cues you're sending and receiving. Experiment with different techniques and see what works best for you. And most importantly, be authentic.
And here's a final thought for you to ponder. As you go about your day, notice the cues that people are giving you, and think about how you might adjust your own cues to create a more positive and productive interaction.
It's a skill that takes time and practice, but the rewards are well worth the effort.
Absolutely. All right, that's a wrap on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.